So I know when we were doing our pre-planning call, we talked about where this can get a little confusing for folks is where does the kit start versus the medical treatment versus if law enforcement's there, if there's medical treatment that you need to be able to provide first. Kind of explain the process of if somebody were to arrive, whether it's with law enforcement or without, what is the process of how you approach someone?
I have a very systematic approach. I do the same thing every single time, every single patient. After I know what, kind of like what other staff have observed in that patient, I will knock on the door and I will ask permission to come in their room. It's their, I'm the empress of the ER, we all know that. We're not arguing. But it's their room and they may have felt safe for the first time all day. And if I come into that space without being invited and having that permission, then I have just completely shattered that sense of safety. And so I want every single thing, every step that I take to provide them safety, trustworthiness, choice, empowerment. I want them to all be pillars of trauma-informed care. So I knock on the door. My name is Jen. I'm a specially trained nurse. Identify who I am, why I'm there. Is it okay if I come in? And if that patient says no, I'd say, no worries, I'm here for 12 hours. Yeah, not going anywhere. I can check back with you and see how you're doing in about 5 to 10 minutes. Can I bring you something? You know, whether it's a warm blanket or whatever. And then I take my step back and I allow them that moment, because honoring the no is the most powerful thing you can do to somebody or for somebody who has just not been honored. I set my clock. I come back exactly when I told them I was going to come back. And even if they don't want anything, I at least at minimum bring them a warm blanket, unless they're hot flashing.
You're a fan.
Yeah. When I come into that room, I am constantly observing the nonverbal body cues, because if I notice that they're looking at me but then they look away, that tells me I've come far enough and maybe I should take one step back. Or if I see just increased fidgeting, change in their body motion, whatever, I typically will not stand over the top of them because that puts me in a position of power and control. I will literally take a knee and make sure that their eye level is higher than my eye level and put them physically in a position of power and control over me. And I will tell them there's a lot of things that I can do to help you right now, but what I want to know are, what are your top worries and concerns? What are you most worried about right now? I listen to all of those concerns, and then I address each one of them individually and let them know how we're going to solve those problems during our time together. And then you can just literally see all the stress just melt away from their body. You're establishing a level of rapport, trust, and you're also getting your care plan together, because you know exactly what kinds of things that you're going to have to deal with. Now, as a nurse, I know that I'm concerned about airway, breathing, circulation, and so I will we'll work together to put together all of our activities that we're going to do, making sure that we're incorporating the medical components that we need to incorporate. So that's usually how I start things, and I'll get all that information first, their narrative, all of that information, so that I know what kinds of exposures have taken place. And then once I've got that information, then I can have a discussion of risks and benefits of doing the exam, which pieces of evidence would be indicated based on their experience that they have had. And I call it experience, I don't call it an assault. I say, based on your experience, this is what's indicated to collect. This is what you're going to taste. This is what you're going to hear. This is what you're going to feel on your body. I go by the 5 senses so they understand what's going to happen. I provide them the opportunity to collect samples. So if they're doing it to themselves, it's less invasive than if I do it, And we discuss the risks and benefits of the full experience of having that evidence collected.
What is the difference between a narrative and like the medical history? And like, again, where does that line, how does it sort of shift when somebody's there and you're collecting information to provide medical treatment, and when are you starting to collect a narrative that potentially will end up being part of their history?
The medical history is oftentimes done before we even arrive there. A lot of times that's from the triage nurse or the secondary nurse. If it's not done, I will complete it. But it really does relate, just as it says, to their medical history. And it may relate to their sexual assault if need be, if they're on their period or if they just have something. We're looking at the medical aspect. The narrative note is what I really mostly focus on in terms of the incident of the assault. that narrative starts from the time that's relevant to the assault. For example, if it's a stranger, it would be the time that they met the stranger. If it's an acquaintance, it could go beyond that, you know, to when did you first meet him, are you dating, have you been sexually at, you know, more things. So I really look at it as two components of it. And a lot of times other nurses are doing the medical piece of it. Because for one thing, we need them triaged and assessed, particularly if we're coming in, so that they're not sitting there being unassessed for the last 30 to 1 hour. Can be very dangerous to the patient. And we've had those occasions occur. So we don't want to overlook that.
So what are tips to gathering information for a quality narrative? What are things that you've learned over time that have worked really well to gather that information?
I think like Jen said, as far as just setting down and not being intimidating, and I'll just say, you know, start where you want to start and just tell me what happened. And so some of that's going to be, you know, some people will just tell you a lot and you'll get all that information, and some don't, and that's fine. But just being, I try not to interrupt, you know, and when I started in the beginning, I'm the first one will admit, like, you got to learn from your mistakes. I would interrupt because I just thought, oh, that's what you do. You know, they say one little part and I need to clarify it. But when you get more training and you realize just how detrimental, and that can just really stop their thought process and not be therapeutic. So just like, you know, it might be a little hard to follow, but waiting till the very end before I'm going to go back and then be like, okay, there's a few things I need to clarify now. I'm not cleaning it up. It's their experience. It's what they tell you. So you know, we're still there to be unbiased on, you know, both ways. We're there to document. Our documentation should stand to educate. You know, if it does go to court, it should be prepared for that. But it's really going to guide you so you know what parts of the exam do I need to do for this patient. Because while there are things that we are going to do the same for every patient, there's some things that are going to be different depending on what type of assault happened and what they tell you. So it really is just kind of like your map, your guide for what you're going to do from that point forward. So
I think it takes a special skill, particularly in the victims that are shut down, who aren't forthcoming. Very often you'll say to a victim, when you sit down and once you've got your rapport, can you tell me what happened? And the first thing will be, well, I was raped. And then they stop. Everybody, we're all going, yeah, okay, I'm sorry that happened to you. I know that must have been very traumatic. Can you give me a little bit more? But you know, that guiding, and you end up guiding them through almost the whole thing, because it's, and then my other favorite part is, okay, well, what did he do next? Well, then he did it.
Yeah. And so we have to clarify what did it means.
Did it, right. Because that's when you have to mix in your understanding of the law, where you have to prove penetration, to where she can tell you what happened with, you want to be, you know, you want to get history without overly traumatizing her, but you have to establish both parts of it. So I think that really is a skill, and you also want to be very careful that you don't appear to be insulting or judgmental when you ask the questions that they all want to know. Did you have anything to drink? Were you doing any drugs? You know, that takes a level of compassion to be able to not leave the victim thinking you're being accusatory and talking to them. So the interview is really a special skill that I think that sets the tone for the rest of the examination, for me anyway.
Well, and y'all have mentioned this a couple of times, being trauma-informed, and I know that was on our planning call. So what do you mean by a trauma-informed narrative? Like, what does that mean?
So I will ask the question, what are you able to recall about your experience? Because that already validates ahead of time that they may not be able to recall all the pieces and the components, and that's okay. Because some of those might come later on in the next days, weeks, months, and I usually encourage them to write that down somewhere and then give that to the detective at some point, because they will have memories come back in little bits and pieces. It's like a plate of glass that's been dropped on the floor and the pieces go shattering everywhere, and a lot of times it's very fragmented and they're just giving us these little bits and pieces and it won't make sense. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll ask that question as a starter, and they may say, like what you're talking about, like while I was walking down the street, he took a gun out, I got in the car, he raped me, I got out. Okay, so that's, okay. So what I do is, and that's all they've given me, and that's when they stop, allowing for pauses, because sometimes it takes a few minutes for them to gather the next thing they're going to say, so allowing for ample pauses. of saying, now you mentioned you were walking down the street, and do you remember hearing anything, seeing anything, working with the five senses, because we know that trauma is remembered by the body, but it is also embedded into the hippocampus in the five senses. And so by gathering information about the five senses in that moment in the experience, you get a whole lot more. Well, I heard a car motor pull up beside me on the left side, and then I looked over to my left and I saw the car. And then, okay, and so type that out, and then, well, tell me more about that. What do you remember happening next? Well, I remember hearing the car window go down, and that's when I saw the gun. And so you're able to tease out a little bit different information and more information about that experience by saying, well, now you mentioned that you saw the car window come down and that there was a gun. Do you remember, anything about or anything being said during that period of time? Well, yeah, he said, get in the car or I'm going to kill you, And so you're able to go back and validate what they've said and then get additional information on top of that.
As far as documentation is concerned, you always want to get their initial statement. And I put that in quotes. And whatever it is they said of exactly what she said, well, he pulled up, he raped me, and that was it. Okay, that is their statement, and I will not change that. I won't put my information into it. I write down what their initial statement was. Mm-hmm. And then we have all spoke to how you have to have clarification pieces, whether it's a drug facilitated assault where she says, I went to the bar, I had a drink, I don't remember anything, and then I woke up naked. Okay, well, I want to know who served the drinks, were her drinks ever not attended, who she went to the bar with, if she remembered, how many drinks she had, if she remembered taking multiple shots, or if she only one. Like, I have questions, but I won't put my answers into her statement piece. I have a statement piece of what she said, and that is her statement. If I have clarification questions, I will write. Ask patient if drink was ever unattended. Patient stated the following, and I will put all of her statements as far as what gathering information of what her statement is. I put all that in quotes, but I'm very careful to state what questions I've asked to get what I want, because you want to have what she stated first, what her statement was in the form in which she wants to report it, and then you need to do your investigation work and you need to ask clarification questions. But I always kind of separate those out or explain that I have clarification questions in the narrative that I'm writing down to give as part of the medical records.
And Natalie and Jen kind of touched on this, but the importance of sometimes a story might come out fragmented and that it can be someone's inclination to want to reorganize. But why is this important? Why is it important to document it as it comes out? How is that actually helpful?
Since that is a sign or a symptom of trauma, of having that disorganization and all of those bits and pieces coming out so fragmented, I have no problem going to court and talking about how that is a manifestation of trauma and going through the cascade of hormones and describing the effects it has in the body and the brain, etc. So it winds up being a tool that we can use in court to educate a jury about what it's like to be in a life and death situation.
Well, yeah, defense is always going to call them on it. Well, was she lying then, or is she lying when she remembered, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's really important that the jury understand that what is a normal for victims and how the body reacts to trauma. The other thing is that I try to represent the victim's feelings at the time of the assault also. Mm-hmm. Because I always looked at, for the victim, as I'm the keeper of the record. Because if we go to trial, it could be 5 years or more down the road because there's no such. She's not necessarily going to remember, and a lot of victims do block that. I want to be able to convey what she was feeling and telling me at the time. And so I kind of teach the nurses that I work with that for every action, there's a reaction. So if he does something that frightens her, I want her reaction to that. So when he pulled the gun and pointed it in your face, what were your thoughts at that time?
Mm-hmm. And what did you think was going to happen?
Exactly. And her response would be, I decided right then I was going to do whatever he said because I wanted to live to see my kids. That's very powerful to come in front of a jury because you're going to have to, because one of the questions I always get at trial is, why were there no injuries? Mm-hmm. Because half the jury's thinking, well, if that was me, I would have fought back. But we all know reality is they don't because of the trauma or whatever reasons, or they know that they don't have a chance. So I want to know if he does something, why did she do what she did so that we can help clarify that. So to me,
in
that's
the patient's
really
own
important.
words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I'll say. Well, when he pointed the gun, what's the first thing that went through your mind? What did you think? Or for a lot of times for the acquaintance assaults, I'll go, when did you first realize things were going wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, well, when he started grabbing at me and I told him I want to go home. And I got up and tried to go and open the door, and he grabbed the door and slammed it and threw me back on the couch. And not only is that important to know and to do that, but I also just established that he kidnapped her, which a lot of the nurses don't understand. He blocked her exit, and they'll charge him with kidnapping and get an easy 15 years. So some of those things you're asking for various reasons, but if you don't ask, they're not going to think to tell you those things. So that's where that action reaction really helps me to clarify for the nurses, because it's easy to remember.
Yeah.
I think it's being careful too, because we are in a unique situation that we still, I mean, all of us nurses, you have to have a defensible practice, but we also have to speak to how we're not putting words in their mouth. Correct. And that how we are making it a very open-ended. So, you know, when they're saying, you know, and then he did it, you're not putting in, oh, so was that when he vaginally raped you? No, you know, they didn't say that. So getting them, I know this is really difficult, but I need you to be very specific, because I can't make assumptions, you know, and I need to hear it, how it happened from you. So I think just spending that time to make sure that when we go to court, we can say, you know, yeah, I didn't lead them. It's my standard of practice that I ask open-ended. I don't lead them in the questions. But this still realizing, while some things kind of overlap medical to the criminal and forensic, like we still are medical first and foremost. So, you know, you'll get, and this can vary some with jurisdiction on how much they like you or don't like you to ask, but I know one of the things you really need to be careful is that there's still that law enforcement component should they decide to go that route. And they're going to be there to ask more of the, describe what he looked like for me, or do all those other things. So we would still, as much as possible, now granted, if the patient tells you all that, fine, you're going to put that down, but still try to keep it a little more medically inclusive.
What is the difference between a law enforcement, what
Yeah.
they're going to be collecting, and what y'all are
I
collecting?
always ask myself, do I need to know this information to provide medical care and safety planning or prophylaxis to this individual? So the things that I need to know about are the areas of exposure. I need to know the kinds of injuries and the mechanism of injury and the physics of the assault. I need to know about the nature of the relationship for safety planning, ex parte, that kind of stuff, or relocation for safety, those kinds of things. Anything that is not related to medical care and safety and things that I would normally do for any patient that comes in the emergency department, and if it winds up kind of being more in the investigative end of things, then I'm stepping out of my arena. I think there is sometimes a little bit of, the more our report looks investigative versus medical, the reason why we're there and the reason why we can testify is because of medical hearsay. Because the person is giving us information that will have an impact on their medical care. And as soon as we step out of that, and go into the investigative and cell phones and locations and what color the car was and how much money was stolen. It's investigative. That has no bearing on medical care. So I don't want my hard work and my patient statement to be argued out of the courtroom because it's not medical hearsay anymore.
And I think that's a really good point, and one that I stress in particular is that we really have to be careful of bias. We are not there to make a case for the victim. The nurses want to make it so she can go and get but that's not it. If what she's telling us is not borne out by the evidence, then it is not borne out by the evidence. We are not there to prove or disprove. We are there to gather what is there to get. And that is it. And the chips will fall where they are, you know, later, because when the investigation goes. And I'd like to say that we never get a false report. They're extremely rare, but we do. But it's not, that's not my concern. You know, I go with what I see and what I can document and what she tells me.
Yeah.